Have you ever looked around and wondered, why is it that even in a world overflowing with conveniences, people still seem restless, anxious, and endlessly chasing after something just out of reach? It's a quiet question, one that sits in the back of your mind when the noise dies down. When the parties end, the phone stops buzzing, and you're left alone in a room full of things you thought would make you happy. But somehow, something feels missing. We live in an age of abundance. Technology places the world in our pockets, comforts surround us, yet depression, anxiety, and loneliness have quietly become the silent epidemic of modern life. Why is that? What is this invisible weight so many of us carry but rarely name out loud? It's easy to believe that suffering belongs only to the poor, the sick, or the brokenhearted. But if you pay close attention, you'll realize it haunts the wealthy, the powerful, the famous, and even those who seem to have everything. That's because suffering isn't always a visible wound. It's often a quiet ache, a persistent restlessness, a yearning for something lasting in a world that keeps slipping through our fingers. There's a story from the time of the Buddha of a man named Kisagatami. She was a mother who lost her only child. Driven mad by grief, she went from house to house, begging for medicine to bring her baby back to life. Every villager shook their head, powerless to help, until someone pointed her to the Buddha. When she reached him, desperate and broken, he promised her he could make a cure, but only if she could find a mustard seed from a house that had never known death. Hope lit up her heart. She knocked on every door in the village asking, pleading. But everywhere she went, she found the same story: a lost father, a missing child, a departed wife. By nightfall, her grief was no longer her own. She understood, for the first time, that suffering is a thread woven through every human life. And in that moment, her heart softened, her mind cleared, and she quietly buried her child. The story may be ancient, but the truth it carries is eternal. Pain, loss, dissatisfaction, they visit us all, no matter how carefully we try to barricade ourselves with wealth, love, or distraction. This is the reality the Buddha called dukkha. But here's the part that most people misunderstand. Buddhism isn't a religion obsessed with misery. It doesn't teach that life is only suffering. What it teaches is that suffering exists, and the first step toward genuine peace is to stop running from it, to face it, and to understand it for what it truly is. Why is that important? Because what we refuse to see, we cannot heal. What we pretend doesn't hurt continues to shape us in ways we don't realize. And so, over 2,500 years ago, under the shade of a Bodhi tree, the Buddha made a simple yet profound declaration. Life contains suffering, but it's not hopeless. There's a reason for it, there's an end to it, and there's a clear path to freedom. This became the heart of his teaching, known as the Four Noble Truths. Not dogma, not blind faith, but an honest, fearless look into the human condition and a way out of it. Imagine someone trapped in a dark, windowless room their entire life. They grow used to the shadows. They stop questioning the absence of light. Then one day, a door creaks open and a beam of sunlight floods in. In an instant, everything changes. The room isn't all there is. There's something beyond the darkness. The Four Noble Truths are like that beam of light. They start with acknowledging the suffering we carry in our bodies, our relationships, our restless minds. They show us that suffering isn't random, nor is it some cruel punishment from the universe. It arises from causes and conditions. And if there's a cause, there can be a cure. They go further, pointing us toward the possibility of an end to that suffering. Not in some far-off heaven, not in death, but here, now, in this life. And finally, they offer a map, a practical, time-tested path known as the Noble Eightfold Path, for anyone willing to walk it. This isn't a philosophy reserved for monks or hermits in distant monasteries. It's for anyone who's ever felt the ache of loneliness in a crowded room, for anyone who's chased success only to find it hollow, for anyone who's lain awake at night wondering, is this all there is? And so today, we begin this journey not to reject life, but to finally understand it. to see suffering not as a curse but as a teacher. And through that, there's a moment in everyone's life when the noise settles, the distractions lose their shine, and you catch a glimpse of something unsettling, a quiet sense of unease. It might happen in the middle of a crowded party, or on a perfect, sunny afternoon, or as you hold everything you thought you wanted, yet feel an emptiness you can't quite explain. This is where the Buddha began, not with gods or creation myths or promises of paradise, but with an honest, unflinching look at life as it is. There is suffering, not because life is cruel, not because we are cursed, but because life, by its very nature, is impermanent, unpredictable, and constantly shifting. And whenever we cling to what cannot last, we suffer. The Buddha called this dukkha. Now, dukkha is often translated simply as suffering, but it's much deeper than that. It's the underlying tension, the subtle dissatisfaction, the restlessness that hums beneath our daily lives. It's the ache of wanting things to stay the same when everything is changing. It's the grief of loss, the sting of betrayal, the frustration of unmet expectations. But it's also quieter than that. It's the discomfort you feel when sitting in traffic, the boredom during a long meeting, the subtle envy when scrolling through someone else's perfect vacation photos. It's in the big tragedies and the tiny inconveniences. It's everywhere if you know how to look. And the Buddha didn't shy away from it. He named it, he faced it, and he encouraged us to do the same. Why? Because when you finally stop running from suffering, when you sit with it, observe it, and truly understand it, something remarkable happens. It loses its power to control you. Imagine for a moment carrying a heavy bag on your back for so long, you've forgotten what it feels like to be free. You've adjusted your posture to the weight. You've convinced yourself it's normal. But what if you stopped, put it down, and realized you never needed to carry it in the first place? That's what the first noble truth asks of us. Not to wallow in misery, not to become pessimistic, but to see clearly what has always been there, and to realize that by seeing it, you can finally begin to let it go. The Buddha described suffering in 3 forms. 1. The suffering of suffering, dukkha. This is the obvious pain, physical illness, heartbreak, grief, fear, the losses we mourn and the hardships we curse. 2. The suffering of change, dukkha. This one is trickier. It's the discomfort that comes when good things inevitably fade. The high of falling in love gives way to routine. The thrill of a new job dulls into obligation. Youth fades into age. Even pleasure turns to pain when we cling to it too tightly. 3. The suffering of conditioned existence, dukkha. This is the subtlest and most profound. It's the constant, background unease that comes from living in a world of impermanence, where everything we depend on is fragile, fleeting, and ultimately beyond our control. Even in moments of joy, there's a shadow of anxiety, because deep down we know it won't last. And yet, this isn't a message of despair. It's a message of awakening. Because once you see the patterns of suffering, you realize they're not personal. They're not punishments. They're simply the nature of conditioned life. And knowing this, you stop blaming yourself. You stop blaming others. You stop the endless war with reality. It's like waking up from a long, uneasy dream. You look around and for the first time, things make sense. That ache in your chest, it's not a flaw, it's a signal, a call to look deeper, to understand, to free yourself. But here's the thing, most people never get to this point. Most people spend their lives chasing temporary fixes, money, romance, status, pleasure. They patch the wound instead of healing it. They numb the pain instead of learning from it. The Buddha invites us to a different path, a braver path. He asks us to stop, to turn inward, and to truly examine the nature of our discontent. Not to escape it, not to drown it, but to understand it. Because in understanding suffering, we unlock the first step toward freedom. Think about it like this. If you're trapped in a room filling with smoke, your first task isn't to imagine fresh air. It's to find the source of the fire. Only then can you escape. In the same way, acknowledging the existence of dukkha isn't pessimism. It's wisdom. It's the courage to see life as it is, so you can finally discover what lies beyond the pain. And once you see it, you'll start noticing how suffering shows up in every corner of life, in expectations unmet, in attachments lost, in the fear of change, in the desperation for control. But here's the quiet beauty in all of this. If suffering has a cause, it can have an end. If there's a fire, there's also a way to put it out. And that, once you've seen suffering for what it is, a natural question follows. If life is marked by this constant unease, where does it come from? What fuels the ache we carry in our hearts? What keeps the wheel of dissatisfaction endlessly turning? The Buddha answered this not with superstition, nor with blame, but with piercing clarity. He traced the roots of suffering to a single cause, craving, tanha, the thirst, an insatiable, restless hunger. It isn't just desire in the ordinary sense. It's a deep, often unconscious force that drives us to cling, to grasp, to hold on. It whispers, if only you had this, then you'd be happy. If you could just avoid that, you'd finally be at peace. It takes many forms: the craving for pleasure, the craving for existence, the craving for non-existence. And like a fire that consumes everything in its path, this craving burns through our lives. It convinces us that satisfaction is just around the corner, in the next job, the next relationship, the next accomplishment. And yet, every time we get what we thought we wanted, the satisfaction fades, and a new craving takes its place. Have you ever noticed it? The momentary thrill of a new phone, a compliment, a dream fulfilled, and then before long it dulls. The mind moves on. It wants more. It wants different. It wants escape. And so we chase endlessly. But craving isn't just about wanting things we don't have. It's also about clinging to what we do. The desperate attempt to hold on to youth, to freeze moments of happiness, to stop time itself. And it's about aversion too, the craving to avoid, to push away, to destroy what makes us uncomfortable. In essence, craving is control. A relentless effort to shape the world to fit our preferences, and an unwillingness to accept life on its own terms. The Buddha taught that this craving arises from ignorance, avijja, the fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of reality. We believe things are solid, lasting, and capable of bringing us permanent happiness. But they're not. Everything is impermanent, everything changes. And the tighter we hold, the more we suffer when it slips through our fingers. It's like trying to grasp water in your hand. The harder you squeeze, the faster it runs out. But here's the subtle brilliance of the Buddha's insight. He didn't teach that desire itself is evil. He pointed to unwholesome craving, the type rooted in attachment, obsession, and aversion. It's not wrong to wish for well-being, to love others, or to seek peace. But when those wishes turn into demands, when they become conditions for our happiness, we become trapped. And so suffering begins. The ancient texts describe three primary forms of craving. One, craving for sensual pleasure, kama tanha. This is the most obvious, the thirst for pleasurable experiences, whether through sight, sound, taste, touch, or thought. Food, sex, wealth, status, entertainment. It promises happiness but only delivers momentary satisfaction. 2, craving for existence, bhava tanha. This is subtler, the craving to become, to be something, to hold an identity. The urge to succeed, to matter, to leave a legacy, to prove oneself. It's the voice that says, I must be more, I must endure, I must be recognized. 3, craving for non-existence, vibhava tanha. Perhaps the most hidden, the craving for annihilation, escape, oblivion. It appears as the wish to vanish, to avoid pain, to numb ourselves from reality. In its darkest form, it leads to despair and self-destruction. And beneath them all is the illusion that these cravings, if fulfilled, will bring lasting peace. But of course, they never do. Think of a moth drawn to a flame. It rushes toward the light, convinced it's salvation. And yet, the closer it gets, the more certain its destruction. In the same way, our cravings lure us into suffering. Not because the world is cruel, but because we misunderstand it. We chase what cannot last. We reject what inevitably comes. and we remain blind to the simple, unadorned beauty of things as they are. But here's the light in this teaching. If craving causes suffering, then by understanding craving, we can begin to loosen its grip. You don't have to destroy desire. You don't have to run away from the world. You simply have to see it clearly. Notice the moments when your mind says, if only. Pay attention to the impulse to grasp, to cling, to control. And in those moments, instead of reacting, pause, breathe, witness the craving without feeding it. Because every time you do, its power diminishes. You become a little more free. And with each act of clear seeing, you begin to understand. You don't have to chase every thought, every want, every fear. You can let them come and go like clouds in a vast, open sky. And what lies beyond craving? That's what the Buddha pointed to next. A place beyond suffering. A state of peace, not because everything is perfect, but because you've stopped needing it to be. It's not a fantasy. It's not a promise of paradise. It's real. It's here. There's a quiet moment, one that arrives after the storm. When the waves of craving settle and the restless mind, just for a second, stops reaching, stops resisting. In that stillness, something remarkable is revealed. The possibility of an end. Yes, the Buddha did not leave us with a diagnosis alone. He pointed beyond the wound, beyond the struggle, to a truth so simple, so liberating it has echoed through centuries. There is a cessation of suffering. A state where the mind no longer clings, no longer craves, no longer fears, where the endless hunger has been understood and gently, naturally released. In Pali, it's called nirodha, the extinguishing, like a candle's flame when the wind passes over it, not destroyed, not forced out, simply no longer fueled. Imagine it, a life untouched by compulsive desire, where joy is no longer tied to conditions, where peace isn't postponed for one day, but lives quietly in each unfolding moment. This isn't some abstract, otherworldly idea. It's the natural consequence of understanding. When craving ceases, suffering ceases. And what remains? Freedom. The Buddha often described this state as nibbana, sometimes translated as enlightenment, sometimes as liberation. But these words are clumsy compared to the experience itself. It's not a place you go. It's not a prize you earn. It's a profound inner transformation, a recognition that nothing external can offer lasting peace, and that it was never meant to. It's a return to simplicity, not by rejecting the world, but by no longer being enslaved by it. You can still walk through cities, laugh with friends, face losses, feel the warmth of the sun, but without the desperate, aching need for things to be any different than they are. That's the miracle, because the problem was never the world. It was the way we clung to it, tried to bend it to our will, made our happiness conditional. And when that craving drops away, even for a moment, what's left is clarity. The mind becomes like a clear, still lake, reflecting whatever appears without distortion. Pleasure comes and you enjoy it. Sorrow comes and you feel it without drowning. Change arrives and you move with it, not against it. The third noble truth isn't a denial of life. It's a deeper embrace of it, an experience of things as they truly are, impermanent, interconnected, and ungraspable. And paradoxically, it's in releasing our grip that we finally hold life properly, lightly, tenderly, without fear. Can such a state be achieved? Yes. Not reserved for saints or sages, but available to anyone willing to look inward, to see craving for what it is, and to discover what remains when it falls away. The ancient texts speak of nibbana as the unborn, the unconditioned, the deathless. But for you and me, perhaps it's enough to say it is peace. Not peace because everything is perfect, but peace because it doesn't need to be. It's waking up from a long, restless dream of if only. If only I had this, if only I were that, if only the world would change, and realizing you're already home. This end of suffering isn't something handed down from above. It's not bought, borrowed, or bargained for. It's realized in the quiet recesses of your own heart. It begins the moment you stop chasing, when you sit with what is, when you stop fighting the rise and fall of things. And in that stillness, you find a joy deeper than pleasure, a freedom greater than escape. It's not the escape from life. It's being fully alive but unbound. And this leads us to a natural question. If this peace is possible, how do we reach it? What path carries us from craving to cessation, from suffering to freedom? The Buddha, ever the practical teacher, didn't leave us guessing. He laid out a clear, time-tested way, a path walked by countless seekers before us. A middle way, neither indulgence nor harsh denial, but a balanced, mindful journey to the heart of freedom. And it's time we walk it together. So now the question lingers. If there's a way to end suffering, how do we find it? How do we walk from craving to freedom, from illusion to clarity? The Buddha didn't leave us wandering in the dark. He lit a path. A way tread by those who sought peace not in distant heavens, but in the steady unfolding of each moment. It's called the Noble Eightfold Path, not a commandment, not a punishment, but a guide. A set of gentle, practical principles that, when lived sincerely, transform the very nature of experience. The path isn't linear. It's not a checklist. It's a living, breathing way of being, one that touches every part of life. And it begins with understanding, right view. It's seeing things as they truly are, recognizing that life is impermanent, that craving breeds suffering, and that peace is possible. It's not a doctrine you memorize. It's the quiet shift when you begin to notice how you react, how you cling, how you fear. And in seeing it, something loosens, like a knot untangling itself. Right intention. Where the mind aims, the heart follows. Right intention means cultivating kindness over hatred, letting go over grasping, compassion over cruelty. It's planting the seeds of peace in your very thoughts and watching them bloom in your actions. Because before a word is spoken, before a deed is done, there's a silent choice, and it matters. Right speech. Words shape the world. They can heal or wound, build or destroy. The path asks, are your words true? Are they kind? Are they necessary? Imagine if every conversation held that awareness. How much quieter, gentler, and clearer our lives might become. Right action. Not perfection, not sainthood, but living in a way that harms neither yourself nor others. It means honesty, respect, and nonviolence. It's the hand that helps, not hurts. And it's often in the smallest gestures, the meal shared, the cruelty withheld, the kindness unasked for. Right livelihood. How you earn your living shapes your mind. The Buddha encouraged work that aligns with compassion, that doesn't trade in harm. It's not about the job title. It's about intention. Are you contributing to ease or to suffering? Are you helping the world wake up or stay asleep? Right effort. Freedom doesn't fall into your lap. It's cultivated. Right effort means gently, persistently steering your mind toward wisdom, compassion, and presence. Not with harshness. Not with guilt, but with the same care you'd give a garden, watering what heals, removing what harms, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Right mindfulness. It's the heartbeat of the path, the steady returning to this moment again and again, not lost in regret, not consumed by worry, but alive, awake, aware. It's feeling your breath as it rises and falls, noticing the warmth of sunlight on your skin, witnessing your anger before it turns to words. It's the practice of being where you are, and in that, finding peace. Right concentration. The mind, like water, is often restless. Right concentration is the stilling of that surface, the gathering of attention into a steady flame. Through meditation, through quiet reflection, we train the heart to remain calm amidst the storm. Not to deny the storm, but to no longer be its captive. And when these 8 are lived, not as rules but as companions, something shifts. Life softens, clarity dawns. Freedom, once a distant hope, becomes an intimate presence. The Eightfold Path isn't a promise of perfect days. It's a promise of a free heart, one that meets both joy and sorrow with wisdom. And it's not reserved for monks on mountaintops. It belongs to you. To the parent calming a crying child, to the worker navigating a difficult day, to the seeker sitting in quiet rooms listening for something deeper. The path is walked step by step, breath by breath, not tomorrow, not one day, but now. And as you walk it, you begin to notice the world hasn't changed, but somehow you have. The old cravings loosen, the needless suffering falls away, and what remains is presence, peace, freedom, a life lived awake. And so the great teaching comes full circle. Suffering exists. It has a cause. It has an end. And there's a way to reach that end. But what does this mean for your daily life? How do these ancient truths meet the messiness of modern days? It's one thing to hear profound truths in ancient scriptures, another to feel their weight in the quiet ache of your own heart. But the greatest challenge, and perhaps the greatest gift, is to live them, not in temples alone, not only on retreat, but in the messiness of everyday life. The Four Noble Truths aren't theories. They're a mirror. They reflect the way we live, how we hurt, and the freedom quietly waiting underneath it all. So how do you practice them when the bills are due, when traffic is unbearable, when your heart breaks or your patience runs thin? Let's begin where every practice begins, with awareness. It's easy to recognize suffering in grand tragedies, loss, illness, death. But the Buddha taught that dukkha, this subtle dissatisfaction, hums in the background of even our good days. That moment you check your phone, hoping for a message that doesn't come. The pang of envy as someone else's life seems shinier, easier. The restless scrolling, the shallow distractions, the quiet loneliness you don't name. That too is suffering. And the first practice is simply noticing it, not judging, not fixing, but pausing long enough to say, here it is. The ache, the craving, the grasping. In that pause, the truth appears, and you're no longer a captive of it. Every irritation, every hurt feeling, every anxious night, it's not random. There's a cause, and it's often closer than we think. When anger rises, ask yourself, what am I holding on to? When jealousy stings, wonder, what am I afraid of losing? Most of our daily suffering is born not from what happens, but from how tightly we cling to how we wish things were. The practice is to catch yourself in the act of craving for control, for certainty, for approval, and gently loosen your grip. Not to pretend you don't care, but to realize you don't need to cling so fiercely. Freedom doesn't mean escaping life. It means meeting it open-handed. The end of suffering isn't some distant future state. It lives in moments. In the deep breath before you speak in anger and choosing silence. In the space between an insult and your reaction. In the rare, precious moment you feel content, not because you got what you wanted, but because you stopped needing it. These tiny moments matter. They teach you that peace isn't a grand achievement, but 1,000 small mercies. It's sitting with discomfort without needing to numb it. It's loving without clinging. It's grieving without drowning. And with practice, those moments grow. The Noble Eightfold Path isn't something you perfect overnight. It's not about flawless virtue or constant mindfulness. It's about showing up, choosing honesty over convenience, choosing patience when irritation is easier, speaking a word of kindness when silence feels safer. Some days you'll forget, some days you'll fall, and that's part of the path too. Because the practice isn't about becoming perfect, it's about remembering the truths that suffering exists, that it has a cause, that it can end, and that you have the power right now to choose a different way. You don't need to leave your job, abandon your relationships, or live in a monastery to practice the Four Noble Truths. You practice them when you check your frustration in traffic, when you forgive someone who hasn't asked for it, when you notice your craving for validation and let it pass like a wave. You practice them in the way you wake up in the morning, in the way you listen without thinking of your reply, in the way you grieve loss without losing yourself. The modern world isn't an obstacle to practice. It's the perfect training ground. Because in a world obsessed with speed, distraction, and acquisition, every act of mindfulness, kindness, and simplicity is radical. This is how the world changes, not through grand revolutions, but through the steady, silent shifting of hearts. One person choosing peace over anger, presence over distraction, generosity over greed, your life becomes a teaching. Your practice, a quiet rebellion against the chaos. And though no one may notice at first, you will, because suffering will soften. And joy, not the fleeting kind, but the steady, luminous joy of a heart unburdened, will begin to fill the spaces where craving used to live. And that is no small thing. So here we are. From ancient forests to crowded city streets, the Four Noble Truths remain not as relics but as living, breathing wisdom. And if you've ever wondered whether real peace is possible in this noisy, complicated world, it is, not all at once, not forever, but moment by moment, choice by choice, step by step, and the next step is yours. Here we stand at the edge of a profound truth. That freedom is not somewhere out there, waiting to be found. It is the quiet space within, the stillness beneath the noise. The Four Noble Truths are not a destination. They are a map, a compass guiding us through the tangled forest of our own minds. Each step we take is both an ending and a beginning, shedding illusions, discovering clarity, reclaiming the peace that was always ours to claim. True freedom arises when we stop resisting what is, when we embrace suffering not as an enemy, but as a teacher whispering the secrets of liberation. This path is not easy. It asks for courage, patience, and most of all, compassion for ourselves and for all beings. And yet, with every mindful breath, with every choice to let go, we move closer to that freedom. Imagine a world where each heart wakes up to this truth, where kindness flows freely, where pain no longer isolates but connects, where the light of awareness dissolves the shadows of fear. This is not just a dream. It's a possibility alive in this very moment, and it begins with you. So if this journey through the Four Noble Truths has touched something inside you, if you feel a spark of curiosity, a flicker of hope, or a quiet determination to walk this path, I invite you to stay connected. Subscribe to the channel for more insights, stories, and teachings that illuminate the path of awakening. Share your thoughts in the comments, your questions, your struggles, your victories, because here we learn and grow together. Remember, every moment you choose awareness, you plant a seed of freedom, and those seeds, when nurtured with care, will bloom into a life of peace, wisdom, and boundless compassion. Thank you for walking this path with me. May your journey be